Welcome everybody. I'm Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of the program, Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. There's a sign-up sheet there on the back. If you're not in our mailing list and you want to be put in that, just write your name and your email. So we have our lecture today. I want to make an announcement also that there is another event on Friday, and I think Israel can give us some of the details of that.
We're going to be inviting Nostra Films back to Madison for a second year, and they're going to be showing Brasil Orgânico, or Organic Brazil, Friday at 4 p.m. in 104 Van Hise. And there's going to be a film critic as well as a commentator from UW-Madison, Dr. Lisa Rausch from the Nelson Institute. So it's a film about environmental studies in Brazil.
Very good.
Yeah, and you can see all the information about our upcoming events at brazil.with.edu.
All right. And well, today's lecture is also co-sponsored by the Brazil Initiative, collaboration between our program and the Division of International Studies, Professor Severino Albuquerque, the director of the program. Thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker today is coming from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. We had been collaborating with UW-Milwaukee for many years, since 1975. We share our federal grant from the Department of Education, the Title VI. We share that with our colleagues at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. So we're very happy to receive somebody who works with them too. And yeah, Professor Gladys Mitchell she received her PhD from the University of Chicago in political science, and now is a visiting assistant professor of public policy at the Department of Africology. And she's gonna tell us about her work on racial versus class discrimination in Brazil. So join me to welcome Professor Mitchell.
All right, so thank you for everyone who helped to organize this. So Professor Alberto Vargas, Professor Severino Albuquerque, and also Angela for all the logistics. That was extremely helpful. So as you can see, my title has changed a bit from what I was talking about before. So this paper, and this is actually a co-authored paper that I'm working on with one of my colleagues at UW-Milwaukee. So we are still talking about race, but in this version, now we're not talking about class discrimination. But I can mention that at the very end if there are some questions. So there is that change. I just want to mention that. This is going to be pretty informal. But still, hold your, if you can hold your questions to the end. So today I'm talking about occupational prestige, skin color in Brazil. So first I just want to talk a little bit about the current state of racial politics in Brazil. In 2004, the first state university implemented affirmative action policies, and this was in Rio, the State University of Rio. In 2012, President Dilma Rousseff enacted legislation that all public federal universities should enact quotas in proportions to state demographics. And public universities are free in Brazil. These are the top universities. So this is huge. It's a really big deal. And in terms of the proportions, so for example, if your state is 20% Afro-Brazilian, black and brown, preto and pardo, then you should enact quotas in that proportion. This is also open to public school students. So there are quotas for students that came from public schools, which in Brazil tend to be the lower quality schools. There are also quotas for them. Black movement activists have advocated for affirmative action policies and black rights throughout history, but a lot of people date this from the 1930s. And then also in 2003, all schools have to teach African and Afro-Brazilian history. So this is when you're thinking about, elementary, middle, and high school. This was enacted in 2003. So again, I'm not going through the entire history of race in Brazil, but I just want to point out this is kind of the current state of racial politics so that you can actually see that this is on the agenda, that politicians, political elites are acknowledging racism and discrimination in society, and not only that, but they are actually legislating racial policies for the Afro-Brazilian population. As I said before, when we think about formal black movement activism, we can trace that since the 1930s. A lot of this was largely led by Afro-Brazilian middle-class people. So again, not exclusively, but when you look at those formal organizations, they were. So if you think about the United Black Movement, if you think about Abdias do Nascimento's movement, the Black Experimental Theater, the Black Brazilian Front, again, these more formal organizations were led by a lot of educated and middle-class Afro-Brazilians. However, today activism takes place in many forms, so it goes beyond just middle-class Afro-Brazilians. So there's evidence in some of the work that I have done in political campaigns, some Afro-Brazilians, and this is for people who, some people have actually won, but some people they know they have no chance of winning, but they use it as an opportunity to talk about discrimination, to talk about racial discrimination. So as they, say, is to conscientizar, to make people conscious of some of these issues. There has also been black women-led grassroots activism. So again, getting at lower income people, but people organizing as black women. And so I'm citing Kia Caldwell's work as well as Keisha Perry's work in Salvador, where she talks about black women in the Gamboa de Baixo neighborhood in Salvador that organized against the land grab. So, but again, organized as black women. Jaime Alves has done some work in Sao Paulo, looking at how black women have organized against police killings, often of their sons. And that's pretty recent. The Mothers of May is the group in Sao Paulo. Hip hop. So Derek Pardue has done work on the role of hip hop, reaching lots of black youth, usually in the periphery. So youth that often feel marginalized, but they talk about the issue of racial discrimination. And then Salas Santos has done work on the NGOization of black activists. So this is black activism being incorporated into more formal organizations. I haven't seen any work on this, but I point out also social media as another form of black activism today. So this is just one example, Bloqueiras Negras. So black women, Afro-Brazilian women, talking about a number of issues from natural hair to black feminism. But again, it's a way, again, to talk about racial issues, to talk about discrimination as based on race and not only color, which is more of what you saw in the past. Kristen Smith has some excellent work and a book coming out in 2016 where she talks about youth-led activism. And so there's a theater group that she focuses on in Salvador, led by black youth, and they address the issue of racism. And so they use it as, well, racism and police brutality, but they use this as an opportunity to teach people about racism. So we have to think about this. All these new forms of activism is pushing against that old way of thinking to say that discrimination is only based on class. So, so that's why I think it's important to kind of highlight this. So coupled with racial policies, there are and different forms of Black activism, they can raise racial consciousness of Afro-Brazilians regardless of class. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because of what I'm going to talk about in the presentation, right? So it's not just limited to middle-class Afro-Brazilians knowing about the issue of racial discrimination. So this is the hypothesis. Afro-Brazilians in high-status occupations are less likely to acknowledge racial discrimination than Afro-Brazilians in low-status occupations. The reason that this is the hypothesis is based on sociological work, or work from sociologists. So this is just a quote I want to read, and then I'll talk about her actual work. If somebody discriminates, I see that this person is not prepared, is not a person who has a formation and education. It happens sometimes with people who have education that has a formation, but in those cases, it is part of their nature, because that person was raised with discrimination in this way and does what he learned. So this is an Afro-Brazilian man that's quoted in Angela Figueiredo's work, and her work was about Afro-Brazilian professionals, middle-class people in Salvador. Salvador is 80% Afro-Brazilian, but one of the, I think if not the first, maybe the second city with the highest inequality between Afro-Brazilians and whites, when you look at the kind of top largest cities in Brazil. But what this person is saying, and what other studies have also found, is that oftentimes when middle-class and professional Afro-Brazilians talk about discrimination, they say, oh, well, this person just wasn't well-educated. And when they say that, they're saying well-mannered. And they usually are talking about someone that they don't know. So, and Silva and Hayes also have some work looking at the same thing, but in Rio, interviewing middle-class Afro-Brazilians. And again, so they do find that they face discrimination, and that's why they call this the elite profile of discrimination, because you actually get more discrimination as income rises. But again, a lot of the examples that they give is, for example, if someone is a doctor, they're mistaken as a nurse. If you are, in another prestigious position, people are often perceived as being in a lower status position. So that's some of the discrimination that they face, but they don't interpret that as discrimination. And so, so they say, oh, well, this person was just not well-mannered and things like that. Marcelo Paixão has some work where he also finds that Black entrepreneurs face discrimination. So. But again, the key thing here is that, yes, of course, discrimination exists, but the way people interpret discrimination, racial discrimination, is very different than what we might think based on these findings. Just a little bit about income inequality in Brazil. So Afro-Brazilians are 51% of the population in Brazil, but the average salary, so for whites, is about 1,600 reais compared to 921 reais for Afro-Brazilians. So on average, Afro-Brazilians make 40% less than whites. I want to see if I have. So I'm just going to read this. And again, this is talking about income inequality for kind of higher status Afro-Brazilians. And this is from Stanley Bailey's work. Hence, we find that the salience of race as a basis for social closure that affects individual earnings is uneven. Moreover, we locate the position in the income distribution at which that closure becomes especially onerous for non-whites, in the top 10 to 20% of the income structure. Whereas Tejas suggests a glass ceiling effect in Brazil, in which the direct and indirect effects of race restrict the entrance of non-whites into the middle class. Our analyses suggest a more elite barrier of white social closure. Notably, our results echo the findings of Grotsky and Pager that U.S. blacks face greater wage inequality in higher positions of the occupational earnings hierarchy. So what he found basically is something very similar to what you find in the U.S. The higher income jobs or more prestigious jobs, you actually get more income inequality. So again, a lot of this is about how people actually interpret it. We know, we can look at the data and see that yes, there's huge inequality based on class, or within these class levels in Brazil. So even for people in prestigious jobs. So the methodology that we use here is the Latin American Political Opinion Project, based at Vanderbilt University, and we're just looking at the Brazil set here. It's a national sample. You have both urban and rural areas included in the survey. And of course, if you want more details about the survey, you can always just look that up on Vanderbilt's website. So what I'm doing today is we are actually going to run our analysis again. So I have some numbers, but these are based on the old analysis. We changed some of these, and hopefully anyone in the audience can help us with these. Because one of the problems that we are having is making sure that we actually rank the occupations correctly. So I'm going to give some descriptive results, and then for our actual analysis, I'm not going to report those numbers. I will just give you the general trends that we find in the data. So what do we find with the survey question, acknowledging discrimination? So this is the survey question. Within the last 5 years, have you sometimes felt discriminated or treated badly in an unjust manner based on your skin color? So for blacks or pretos, 13% say a lot, 14% say sometimes, 16% say few times, and then 57% say never. For browns or pardos, only 2% say a lot, 4% say sometimes, 6% a few times, and then you can see here, huge discrepancy. 88% of browns say they have never faced skin color discrimination in Brazil. And you can see the difference between the two groups. But so throughout the presentation, when I say Afro-Brazilian, I'm referring to both groups, unless I split it up just like I just showed you. But this is something that I think is very important. The other thing that's really interesting is actually when you look at U.S. data, you would think that for African Americans, when you ask this question, have you experienced discrimination? Most people, would think it would be like 90%, but it's actually not. It's much lower than you would expect. From what I remember, it was maybe 55%. It's still very interesting to me. But then when you look at the question, is there discrimination against blacks or African Americans, then you get a huge percent, over 80%. But you also get something similar in Brazil. So in general, it appears that not only in the U.S., but also in Brazil, people are less willing to say they have actually experienced discrimination. So this is the part that I was telling you that we were kind of having some trouble grouping these. And I have it in English too, but I wanted to put it in Portuguese first. So these are the categories we have. So we have high, medium, medium low, and low. So this is the Portuguese version, and then I am, oh, sorry, yeah, sorry about that. So, but you can see here for the funcionários do governo, we have them in high. I had no doubt about that one. University professors, high. Yeah, I know that's definitely a bad thing. And some of this is based on some articles that I've read that were published by Brazilians. And then, so this one, the director, we have this in medium high. Also for school teachers, we also have that as medium high. And then here for the medium, we have secretaries, we also have electricians, carpenters, and then this is the medium low, and then low domestic workers. And I'm just going to go ahead and flip to the English version. So these are the raw numbers. But again, it's the same thing over here. It's just I broke it out by occupation, and of course it's in English. So again, if anyone thinks that we should change some of these, please let me know, because this is actually the new ordering by occupation. There were at least 2 that we changed, and so that's why we're going to do the analysis again. But again, so what I wanted to point out here is when you look at specialized workers, machine operators, and then street vendors, this is where you get some of the largest numbers. And again, these are the raw numbers for both blacks and browns. Street vendors, 101 for browns, 22 for blacks, and then for specialized workers, 22 for blacks and 93 for browns. And then after that, kind of the, I guess, second most popular category for browns would be support personnel, which is kind of medium status is what we have. And then 12 for blacks in that one. And for domestic workers, we have 12 blacks and 50 browns. This is the one we had a question about, the agriculture. So there are 2 categories for agriculture, and the only difference is that one is owner of land. At first we had that one in the low category, but then we put it in medium low, thinking that if someone owned their own land, that's perhaps more a higher status than if you were just working on someone's land. But you can see 56 browns in that category, and then 5 blacks in the owner of land. So again, just to kind of recap what we are actually testing and interested in. So the dependent variable is discrimination based on color. So according to occupational prestige, are you more likely or less likely to acknowledge skin color discrimination? That's basically the big question. So these are the variables that we consider. Occupation, grouped by prestige, which is what you all saw. Income, province, skin color, and this is actually, they have an actual skin color palette, so that's what I'm talking about with skin color. Gender, education, urban versus rural, and then the race or color that the respondent identified as. We're only looking at Afro-Brazilians, so it's either preta or parda. And then we have a work experience variable, which was calculated with age. So we first ran a multinomial logit, but I think we are actually going to run an ordered logit, since the discrimination question is never, a few times, sometimes, and a lot of times. So it is actually ordered, so we're going to run the order. But I'm reporting the multinomial logit results. And again, these are just our general trends, so I'm not putting our numbers up here. So in terms of what are these statistically significant variables, so yes, skin color, that's not surprising. So the likelihood of reporting that one has experienced color discrimination increases as skin colors are darker, right? So darker skinned Afro-Brazilians are more likely than lighter skinned Afro-Brazilians to report experiencing color discrimination. Gender, this one is kind of interesting to me. Afro-Brazilian men are more likely than Afro-Brazilian women to report they never experienced color discrimination. Afro-Brazilian men are less likely than Afro-Brazilian women to report they have experienced color discrimination a lot, sometimes, or a few times. And then in terms of race or color, blacks, pretos, are less likely than browns to say they have never experienced discrimination. So in other words, pretos are more likely to have experienced color discrimination or to say that they have. And then in terms of urban versus rural, Afro-Brazilians in urban areas compared to those in rural areas are more likely to say they have experienced color discrimination many times, sometimes, and a few times. Now for the one that the variable that we are really interested in. So Afro-Brazilians in the most prestigious occupations are more likely to report never experiencing color discrimination. And then Afro-Brazilians in the most prestigious positions are less likely than those in the least prestigious occupations to report experiencing color discrimination a lot or sometimes. So one of the reasons that I was saying earlier that we kind of changed this paper is that we got some really, really hard to explain results when we looked at both class and discrimination. And so one of the results we got, which we ran it so many times and still got the same thing, was that actually Afro-Brazilians in the most prestigious positions were more likely to say they experienced discrimination based on class. That actually makes no sense. Because if you are high status, then it should be more difficult for you to say that you experience discrimination based on your class. The common discourse is to say, oh, we only face discrimination because we're poor. That's the discourse in Brazil. So that's why we are only focusing on color discrimination right now instead of comparing those two in the analysis. The other thing that I also want to point out is that the survey question is concerned with color discrimination in general. So it's not just saying discrimination based on color at your job. It's just a general question. So that's one thing that I want to note. Explaining the results. So these are the things that we are thinking about right now. So one is that Afro-Brazilians in extremely prestigious occupations experience so much discrimination, or what Philomena Essett calls everyday racism, as they are the minority in these occupations, that they no longer consider everyday racism as discrimination. And this goes for African descendants, not only in Brazil, but even in the US. It's so everyday that people talk about microaggressions and all these things. But again, it's so everyday that perhaps they don't even think about that as racism or consider it as racism. The second one, which is, so my colleague is an economist, and so he was thinking, well, maybe it just means that actually they don't experience discrimination. That, of course, goes against the literature. So I really don't think that will work as an explanation. And then the third is that these results are driven by the large number of pardos in the sample. So I'm thinking maybe that might explain some of the results. And as you could see, even when I had the raw data, So we have, I think, over 1,000 particles in the sample compared to